So, in your work with women, what is the most common situation or event in a woman's story that kind of sets her up to be vulnerable to porn use or other unwanted sexual behaviors?
Even speaking from like my experience and speaking from many of the women that we work with, what sets them up, I don't know that there's any sort of specific event, but I do know that early exposure to pornography.
Mm,
So like I was 10 years old, and that
Mhm.
seems to be a common thread where they're finding porn, being exposed to porn at a very young age. It immediately, like, it destroys any proper understanding of sex.
Mhm.
mm,
And what porn teaches you is a lot of the times it's women have to be desirable, they
Mhm.
have to be approachable, they have to say yes, like they're always willing and ready. And I think that it just kind of teaches women about who they are sexually when in reality that's not what is true. And obviously, when you're exposed to pornography that young, you have a sexual awakening before you're really ever meant to. And so you're exploring your body, you can become addicted to masturbation, like there's all kinds of things that are happening. And so from the many women that we work with, I would say that catalytic event
Mhm.
is just the exposure. It takes them from innocence to, they're no longer innocent when it comes to their sexuality and sex, and it wreaks havoc going forward, especially as they enter into puberty and the expectations that they feel are on them.
Yeah, and in my work with Unraveled, I see that same common thread of early exposure. And sometimes it's, I mean, like you said, Crystal, we're 38. So it could have been medical books back at 30, when we
Yeah,
were 10. It could
yeah.
have been just the encyclopedia and moving to all the parts that have the private parts, and like
Mm-hmm,
I
mm-hmm.
remember doing that kind of stuff. It wasn't always just something. I found porn under the bridge, like real old school kind of ways of stumbling across it, not like today where it's just everywhere. But then also a common thread I see is some kind of unresolved, perceived or real mother or father wound
mm,
with the
Yeah.
women, and um, really not knowing how to work through their feelings, express them, because we all know there's such a connection between thoughts and feelings and behaviors, and if one of those things gets stuck, like okay, we're exposed to porn and maybe we're masturbating and we're having these thoughts and feelings, and then it just creates this whirlwind, or cyclone, as Heather kind of created, I guess. And something needs to get unstuck. So yeah, it seems like it's a combination of
Mm-hmm.
things, root issues that cause that, but now
mm,
you just cannot escape it. It's everywhere. So now it's like, okay, if back in the day we say the ones that had the early exposure were the ones most vulnerable from what we could see, what happens now in our society when every single little kid is exposed at some point?
Mm-hmm.
Every
Mm-hmm.
single kid is going to be exposed to something sexual. And
Yeah.
that's just really frightening.
I really like the way that you phrased that about that it's kind of this awakening because I think that a lot of kids, especially when they're so young, they don't even know what to do with
Mm-hmm.
that. And of course, they don't necessarily go and tell their parents, but yet
Mm-hmm.
it creates this excitement and
Yeah.
shame at the same
Yeah.
time. And I could see how it just also creates kind of their own little private prison that they live in. And kids don't even know, a lot of them don't even have the language to articulate, what they're feeling or what they've come across or,
Mm-hmm.
and so I could see that just being something that really is so harmful to women in the long run.
You just entirely told my childhood story just
Mm,
then. It is the exposure. I always say that it was the first time I ever really remember experiencing shame
mm,
that wasn't associated with like discipline, like being in
mhm,
trouble. And so, yes, there was this massive amount of intrigue and curiosity, but then of course there was this immense amount of shame.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't want to tell anyone. I didn't feel like I could without getting, in more trouble or getting my brother in trouble for having porn. There was all kinds of things that were going on that would have kept me in the dark. And going back to what Ashley you were talking about in terms of a mother or father wound, that's absolutely relevant as well, because I mean, for me, my first love was food. Like
Mm-hmm.
I was a lot, I was alone a lot when I was little. And I didn't know how to deal with my big feelings. And so I would
Mm.
eat and I would hide food and sneak food. And then when I found porn, it became the replacement for it. And so it really did kind of like become a new coping, mechanism for me.
Mm-hmm.
And because I did have so much shame about it, it was my secret for 10 years.
Do you see that a lot? Because I do in my unraveled groups, and that's my story too, of this pendulum of like overeating and then
Yeah.
acting out sexually. And I've read that there's such like an intertwine between eating disorders for women and
Hmm.
sexual acting out or
Hmm.
unhealthy sexual behaviors. Do you see that a lot too?
Absolutely. You talk about the pleasure center of the brain and dopamine.
Mhm.
So food and sex
Mm-hmm.
create the same reaction in the brain. And so if you have somebody who struggles with food and then finds porn, there is kind of a transference that can happen. And then when you're in recovery from porn, finally, you go back to having food
Right.
issues a lot of the time
Mhm.
as well. So there is kind of this tension of like going back and forth and really and that's why it's so important to get to the root of
Yeah.
why
Yes.
you're acting out, whether it's with food, whether it's with porn, whether it's shopping, there could be
Right.
all kinds of things. The root is the same. Let's find out what that is and fix it.